Welcome to our discussion on a new way to think about cyber resilience, mean time to clean recovery, or MTCR. I'm joined by two experts who created this MTCR concept, Darren Thompson, Field CTO at Commvault, who works closely with organizations across industries on resilience and strategies, and Duncan Bradley, UKI Security and Resiliency Practice Leader at Kyndryl. They authored the original thought leadership of MTCR. And for years, organizations have been measured recovery success by how quickly systems can be restored. We use acronyms like RTO and RPO, RTO, Recovery Time Objective, RPO, Recovery Point Objective. But in today's threat landscape, we know that speed alone does not equal safety, and it doesn't equal recovery success. If the data you recover isn't clean and trustworthy, you risk turning your recovery into the continuation of another attack. Hi, I'm Danielle Scheer, Chief Trust Officer at Commvault, and I spend a lot of my time helping boards and executives understand how cyber risk meets business risk. I'm very excited to guide today's discussion and to unpack why this new concept, MTCR, isn't just another technical metric, but the business standard that now belongs in the boardroom. Let's have a shot at this.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle, and thanks for the great intro. Just this year, in 2025, in the UK in particular, but actually all over the world, particularly Europe, we've seen some focus attacks on retail, and we've seen firsthand just how hard it has been for those retailers to stay engaged with their customers and, importantly, recover their systems. This year, I was personally involved in a particular attack, started around the middle of April of 2025. And just to give you a bit of a sense as to the timeline that took place for that business to recover, in the April period, there was essentially a ransomware event. And during that period, the business did a great job at kind of, if not stopping that event, isolating and stopping the spread. In the May timeframe, they moved into trying to confirm the nature and the scope, what I call the blast radius of the attack. And they started to communicate out. And then from May through to the beginning of August was the actual recovery of systems. So in other words, pushing 3 months and through the August timeframe, then only a phased approach to reintroducing systems. So why all of that time? 3 months as good as to bring that business back online. Well, much of that time was spent trying to find the right data, the clean systems with which that business could rely and get back to engaging with their customers and generating their revenues as a retailer. And that right there, that kind of 3 month period is indicative of what we want to talk about here. The business has got to start asking a different set of questions of the IT organization in order to get to a place where not only can promises be made in terms of how quickly can we restore systems, but promises can start to be made about how clean those systems are going to be, how clean that data is going to be. Otherwise, I'm afraid we are going to continue to see, typically 2, 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 months to bring systems back online.
Okay, that's fascinating. You gave us a lot to work with. Duncan, let me now go back to the beginning. Can you give us the definition of MTCR, talk us through the 5 pillars, and just why that is the right way for us in this landscape, this threat landscape, to measure success in a recovery?
Yeah, sure, Danielle. So I think it's really important. We came up with the concept of mean time to clean recovery to really be a business metric for something that the business could understand. This is about how long it takes them to get back online, as Darren was saying, with clean data, with systems that can operate and be back into production. Most organizations have really focused on availability of their systems being available online without understanding that these cyber attacks, they take out the data and the platforms that support those operations. So when you come to a cyber recovery event, it's more a case of you've got to re-establish from day one to recovery point a clean environment. So that often takes days, as Darren was saying in the retail example. You then need to rebuild all your foundational services. You then need to bring your platforms back online, and then you need to recover clean data into it. And quite often, with the types of attacks we're seeing, is that data is contaminated for days, if not weeks, prior to the attack. So you need to look into your backups and bring back that clean data back into production. This MTCR, this mean time to clean recovery, is meant to be a business indicator to say, how long can you be out for? How long would you be out for today if the event happened? And then this is used to challenge the IT and the CISO organizations to shrink that mean time to recovery.
And so, how is MTCR different from traditional measures? It sounds like it's sort of a lot of the traditional measures in one larger measure.
Well, I think this is where recovery time objectives, how long does it take to get that system back online? It doesn't take into account what type of data is going to be within that platform. And typically they use as availability. How long does it take me to fail over from data center A to data center B in that traditional infrastructure attack? Recovering data back is a much more complicated endeavor. It's not just about getting a data set back, it's about getting the platform back online. So if you think about identity services, you need your identity working before anyone can access the data. Just measuring how quickly it takes to get a database back doesn't mean that business process will be back online. And it's really designed to encapsulate those different pillars of those systems that you need to bring online to be able to get the business process working.
And Danielle, if I may, I think this talks to a larger problem. So it's very easy to go down the technical route on this conversation, and indeed this represents in many ways a way of measuring the technical organization. But I think this speaks to an organizational problem. What we see all of the time is that one of the issues culturally around recovering systems, and one of the reasons it takes so long in many cases, as was the case in my example, is we're actually there are two teams that need to take some responsibility here. There is clearly the traditional kind of infrastructure team, the people responsible for backup and recovery. Clearly, they have a job to do, but it isn't only them anymore. It's a security team as well. The team that can tell you via, forensics, for example, where the clean backup is, where the clean data is, how infected systems are. That's a security team. So where those teams are not working together on recovery, or they're speaking different languages, or they're measuring themselves in different ways, we start to see a problem, and it starts with culture. So one way of thinking about this is if you take RPO and RPO, recovery time objective, how long is it going to take me to recover? Recovery point objective, how much data am I likely to use? And you combine that with the business of forensics, a security discipline. Now we've got MTCR. So this is that the C is important. The cleanliness of that data is really, really critical. And the starting point here, as no doubt we'll discuss, is let's just have the business ask that question. How long can we get our systems back clean? And that's, what we see every day is that's not that tricky a question to ask, but a really tricky question to answer, particularly where there is that cultural gap between the security and the infrastructure team.
I really think that's what the brilliance of MTCR is, because you take a number of very technical concepts that IT and security teams measure themselves on, and you turn it into something that you can talk about with CEOs and boards of directors. So taking your example, Darren, of a retailer at Christmas who has experienced a cyber attack, how would you use MTCR if you were standing up in front of a board of directors to explain what's happened and how the recovery process is going?
Well, I'll start the response, and I'm going to hand off to Duncan to end the response, because there's a bit of this paper that Duncan was very responsible for to do with really the grouping of assets that combine into a service. But I'll start by saying there's a couple of discussions that need to be had that very often are not being had. One is around risk appetite. So who are we as a business? What kind of a business are we? A retailer, typically you'll see a sort of a low to medium appetite for risk, somewhere around there. But that needs to be defined so that moving down the line, as we start to understand the risks that surround us, we can decide what's acceptable and what should be shared via insurance, for example, and what should be absolutely be mitigated. So that's conversation one. Conversation two is then, what's the minimal viable company here? It is completely unrealistic to assume that any organization with any amount of budget is going to be able to recover everything in the business quickly. So what really matters in this business? That's a very, very deep and interesting conversation to have with most businesses. Most businesses cannot imagine a world with IT. And so they find it very hard to unravel the business processes and have a conversation about, well, if we were back to paper, what would this look like? But that conversation kind of needs to happen. And where it leads us is to get to what we call an MVC, a minimal viable company. That is, what stuff needs to be back in a day, or whatever the timeline is that we decide. What is the stuff that without it, this business doesn't run at all? We're not operating. And that's a very, very important discussion. What you can then start to do is wrap the MTCR concept around the minimal viable company. And I'll hand off to Duncan now, who can sort of define for us what makes up a service. How do we think about this in context of services?
And thanks, Darren. And again, it is, without trying to get too complicated and too deep, MTCR is about measuring mean time to clean recovery of a business process, a critical business service that then flows up to make the overall minimal viable company. So there'll be multiple different MTCRs for different business processes. I was just literally today talking to a consumer product goods company, a brewer, and they were talking about, well, if we lose 4 days worth of data, we have to literally pour 4 days worth of beer down the drain because we can't prove it's safe to drink, so therefore we can't sell it. So within this concept is about dissecting those business processes and then using that MTCR as a common business language to then be able to say, right, within my process, I need to then, this process is reliant on numbers of different types of applications. They all rely on foundational services, things like identity, the ability for the customers to log into the platform. You then have your back-end systems, whether that be in cloud or on-prem, your hypervisors, your critical cloud solutions, your front-end systems that run the actual applications, and then your user access systems where actually how people get access to that solution. Is it via PDAs, point of sale devices, etc.? All of those need to be available for that business service to run. So it's the MTCR is designed for the business owner to own it. First step in that journey is to then benchmark what is their current MTCR. How long would it currently take them, even if they could get back to clean data? Because that's the shocking point at the moment is that most organizations do not have technology in place that allows them to protect their backups and be able to interrogate their backups to take out clean data, which is the real business problem that we're here to solve.
It's very interesting. You said, what is the current MTCR? So MTCR isn't a measurement that's taken at the end to measure how well we recovered. MTCR is taken at intervals throughout the entire attack. And that's probably because if you rush to a recovery, you can actually do more damage. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can certainly pick that up. Before I do that, though, you made reference to a really interesting point here, which I think needs to be extended further. So MTCR is not just something you would measure throughout the recovery from an attack. It's something you should be measuring pre-breach. So what I call kind of left of bang. When we introduce this concept into boards of directors, we start to see this permeate through an organization. And the question is asked, what is the MTCR, for example, for our minimal viable company? We're going to get some answers we don't want to hear, like we don't know what a minimal viable company is, or even if we do, realistically, our MTCR right now is probably 4 months. Right? We don't want to hear those answers, but we need to hear them in order that we can then focus on improving. And so that's a really, really sort of important point, I think.
And Darren, to build on that, I think that it's vital for the business to understand what their MTCR is today, because this then informs their business risk process properly. And it's not always going to be a technology solution that's going to reduce that MTCR. Quite often, if the business know that they've got this risk that they might be without a critical system for a certain period of time, they can build in an alternative business continuity plan. Return to paper, might be the worst case, Darren. But right now, business do not understand the risks that they're covering, and this MTCR is meant to be this ability for the board to go into the CISO and the CISO teams and say, how long realistically would we be down today? And then if that's an acceptable number, and I've done a number of these sort of studies, and it's 28, 35, 42 days not often. The business is then totally horrified that they would be without IT services for that amount of time. but they've never put those demands on the CIO or CISO organizations to say, we need the minimum viable company, these assets back online within 24 hours. How can you design those business processes to be recoverable within 24 hours? It needs to be a functional and non-functional requirement of their business to say, these are our requirements. IT, CISO, can you help me meet them?
And just going back to the point I made earlier, by the way, it's really important to understand that in some ways that question cannot even be asked of one or either of those teams. The only time you're going to get any kind of response that makes any kind of sense, even if it's not a response that you want, is if you have the infrastructure team and the security team in the room to answer it, because the question just can't be answered by either or of those teams. And that's, again, culturally, this is so important. Before we get anywhere near technology, culturally, this is, what we're trying to do here with this concept is drive some behavior that doesn't exist today.
That's right. You're trying to break down silos. So each organization, whether it's IT or the infrastructure team or SecOps, is sort of my part's fine, but all those parts have to work together. And so MTCR brings them together and makes them think about this concept of risk in the environment as every single person has a part to play in that. And then I think it's really transformative in that it gives every single one of those leaders an ability to translate to a CEO or a board of directors and speak about what they're actually experiencing in terms of, recovery in business risk, right?
Absolutely. That's it. Spot on.
So how does it connect to simple requirements? Not so simple, but compliance requirements like DORA and NIS2. How does MTCR speak to that, if at all?
Well, I'll start if that's okay, Duncan. So here's my initial thinking on that. And, Danielle, you and I have both been through those DORA articles plenty of times together and spoken about compliance. One of the things that we're starting to see in the compliance landscape, whether it be DORA or NIS2 or other global regulations, is this mention of, number one, what resilience means as opposed to security, and number two, testing, right? So have you tested? Do you have a plan? Have you tested the plan for recovery? Well, I think this speaks directly to what should be the measurement of the plan. I'm slightly concerned that many of the regulations I see, even the evolving and newer regulations, are still making reference to things like disaster recovery. They're still not being very explicit about what should be tested. I've even seen some mentions of RPO, RTO. And so to a certain extent, this is a concept like this is important as people start to become compliant and move into that kind of compliance that's very resilience based. In terms of, what are we going to measure here? Because if we just measure old disaster recovery metrics, we're really not going to move very far forward here. What we're going to find is we get attacked, we go to our DR plan, we execute the DR plan, and surprise, surprise, we can't find our clean backup, and it takes us 30, 40, 50, 60 days to recover. So we've got to change the mentality here. And with regards to compliance, it was so refreshing to see some of the new compliance sort of policies and schedules mention resilience, recovery, and testing. But we've got to make sure that we think about those in the right way and with the right kind of frameworks and contexts.
Yeah, I totally agree, Dan. I think if you look at a lot of the requirements from DORA and what the European Central Bank have said about stress tests, most organisations have set themselves up to fail because it says you've got to prove that you can recover within your business impact tolerance. And most organisations are setting that business impact tolerance on availability metrics or the old DR plan that says I can fail over from data center A to data center B in 4 hours. You can't recover an entire bank or an entire financial institution in 4 hours. It's impossible. So I think, and this is sort of highlights the need for this new vocabulary of MTCR so that they can re-look at that business tolerance, that business impact tolerance, to redefine it to say, if I lose my core system, for example, my ledger, how do I operate? Well, I can't operate, so therefore I need to put in contingency plans of how I can sub-process to then be able to roll back once you get your ledger back online in a financial example. But you said about testing. Most organisations, when I ask that question to, when did you last test DR? they point back to their traditional DR plan. They're not pointing to their cyber recovery plan, because most organizations haven't yet fully designed and implemented a cyber recovery plan. And absolutely, this MTCR needs to be one of those key metrics within that cyber recovery plan. You've designed your scenarios you're going to protect yourself and recover against, and then you have an MTCR measurement for those different types of attack. It's really here to try and, as I say, bridge that gap between business and IT and CISO.
Darren, you were saying it's about changing the culture, and Duncan, you were just saying so many contracts between organizations do require a recovery time, and that's meaningless. So it's not just for the technical teams, but also the enterprise risk management teams, the lawyers who are contracting, to understand that RTO and RPO are not enough, but the new standard is clean recovery, and everybody needs to understand what the end result should be, not sort of the pieces along the way that might be meaningless, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I fully expect as we move forward with the concept and we run workshops around preferred risk posture and around minimal viable company and around the MTCR, I expect us to discover that, perhaps many more people than traditionally would have been associated with system recovery need to take an interest and have a voice in those workshops for precisely the reasons you mentioned, Danielle.
So for leaders listening, I encourage you all to check out the full report. It's called Redefining Cyber Recovery, Introducing Mean Time to Clean Recovery. And I have one more question for Duncan and Darren, which is, you've covered a lot of ground today. You've grounded it in a real application for a real business, which makes a lot of sense. For leaders listening, where do we start? Where do we start right now? We read the report and we want to introduce this concept into our companies, into our businesses. How do we get started?
Well, for me, for a non-technical leader, I would encourage the calling of a meeting between whoever's responsible for infrastructure delivery in the company, normally a CIO, and whoever's responsible for cybersecurity in the company, normally a CISO, may not be. Call a meeting with those two individuals, those two leaders, and ask the question: how quickly, if we were to suffer a catastrophic ransomware attack, let's use ransomware as an example because it's prolific and we're all being affected by ransomware. So in the event of a catastrophe with ransomware, how quickly could you restore this business together and guarantee me that the data I'm about to start using to run the business is clean? I guarantee you 5 other meetings will be spawned from that one meeting, because the answer's not easy. It will require collaboration across those teams. It will require a mindset change as well.
And I think, Darren, I would say a very similar thing, apart from I'd probably widen that audience to bring in people like their chief risk officer and procurement into that conversation, because most organizations, when they look into whether it's a SaaS contract or whether it's an outsourcing contract, it's generally silent on this cyber recovery. When can I get recovery back to clean data? Because in most of those types of contract, it is the customer that's responsible for their data. Those infrastructure suppliers and those SaaS suppliers are responsible for the infrastructure that supports that service. So, it's them. They've got to own that responsibility for getting their clean data back. But also they then need to disseminate that quite quickly to their business leaders to try and really understand what is our MVC, because organizations will, as you said earlier on, Darren, just cannot afford and will never be able to recover their entire enterprise's systems within a very short period of time. The key here is about prioritizing, and only the business can judge what is most important to them in a disaster cyber boom situation.
Darren, CTO Commvault, Duncan, security and resilience practice leader at Kyndryl, thank you so much. Next steps, I hope you guys take this MTCR concept on the road and help business leaders workshop it. And I fully expect we will start seeing this show up all over globally as we help our companies figure out the MVC for each of them. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Danielle.